wrote the song My Way for Frank Sinatra.
Yeah.
He should have blown you. I mean, that was some song.
That is a great
That was low on my list of what I wanted from Frank Sinatra.
He gave Frank Sinatra the most iconic song of his career, but you've probably never heard the real story behind it. For decades, Paul Anka stayed quiet, watching from the sidelines as My Way became a global anthem, forever tied to a man who didn't write a single word of it. Anka was the genius behind the lyrics, the architect of Sinatra's final act. But behind the scenes, their relationship was far more complicated and at times deeply unsettling. Now, at 84, Paul isn't holding back anymore. He's peeling back the curtain on what it was really like to be part of Sinatra's world, one built on charm, control, and quiet intimidation. And what he reveals might just change the way you hear My Way forever. The dreamer from Ottawa. Before he was brushing shoulders with legends, Paul Anka was just a wide-eyed kid from Ottawa with a piano, a dream, and an almost obsessive drive to make it big. At only 15, he poured his first heartbreak into a song called Diana, a simple melody written for a girl who barely noticed him. He recorded it with a borrowed $100 and a prayer. What happened next was nothing short of surreal. Diana shot to #1 in multiple countries, selling over 10 million copies. Practically overnight, Paul became a teen idol. But unlike the other stars of that era, he wasn't just a pretty face singing other people's songs. He was writing every lyric, shaping every melody, and controlling his own narrative. And he was just getting started. By 18, he had already toured the world, stood on stages most artists only dreamed of, and signed a major deal with ABC Records. But while the spotlight followed him everywhere, Paul was already looking beyond the fame, towards something bigger. He didn't just want to be remembered as a hitmaker. He wanted to write something that would live forever. And in the back of his mind, he already knew the man who would help him do it. The night he wrote a legend. It happened in one sitting. One quiet night in New York City, 1968. Paul Anka was in his hotel room when he heard a French song on the radio, Comme d'habitude, a tune with a haunting melody but lyrics that didn't quite hit. Still, something about it stuck with him. He called the French publishers the next day and bought the rights for $1. Not because it was cheap, but because he had a vision. A very specific one. That same week, he had dinner with Frank Sinatra. Sinatra, tired of the business, told Paul he was thinking of retiring. That one comment sparked something in Anka. He returned to his hotel, sat at his typewriter, and by 5 a.m., he had written My Way. The lyrics weren't about Paul's life. They were written entirely in Sinatra's voice. Every line crafted with Frank in mind. The power, the bravado, the regrets. I planned each charted course. It wasn't just a song. It was a legacy, gift-wrapped and ready to be delivered. The next morning, he called Sinatra and said, "I've got something for you. It's yours." What neither of them realized was that this song would become more than just Sinatra's swan song. It would become his anthem, and decades later, it would become the center of a much deeper, more personal tension between the two men. Because even though Sinatra made it famous, he didn't write it. And that truth always lingered, unspoken, but never forgotten. Entering Sinatra's world, writing My Way didn't just give Paul Anka a songwriting credit. It opened a door into one of the most exclusive, cutthroat circles in show business, Frank Sinatra's inner world. And that wasn't a place for the faint of heart. The Rat Pack, Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., and their crew, was more than just a group of entertainers. They were power brokers, cultural icons, and untouchable figures in Las Vegas and Hollywood. Most artists never got close. But Paul, he was invited in. Still in his 20s, he found himself seated at tables where decisions were made in whispers over cigars. He watched the Rat Pack up close, how they moved, how they protected each other, and how they used charm like a weapon. It was thrilling, intoxicating, and dangerous. Frank took a liking to Paul, but the relationship was complicated. To the world, Sinatra was the ultimate alpha, larger than life. But behind closed doors, he could be volatile, unpredictable. One night, he'd toast Paul as the genius behind My Way. The next, he'd brush him off with a glare that could freeze a room. And Paul learned quickly, Frank's praise was gold, but it came with strings. You didn't outshine him. You didn't correct him. And above all, you didn't challenge the myth of Sinatra. Paul had walked into a world of legends. But in that world, respect could vanish in a second, and power was the only thing more valuable than fame. The night everything changed. For years, My Way had been a bridge between Anka and Sinatra, one that connected their legacies in a way few songs ever could. But that bridge began to crack one night in the early 80s. It was a black-tie gala in Los Angeles, packed with Hollywood elites. Sinatra was the headliner, and Anka, as usual, was in the crowd, no longer the kid from Ottawa, but a hitmaker in his own right. The atmosphere was celebratory until it wasn't. Mid-performance, Sinatra paused. He looked out into the crowd and, with a wry smile, introduced the next song. This one, he said, was written by a guy who's somewhere out there tonight, Paul Anka. A hell of a writer, even if he never shuts up about it. The room laughed, but Anka didn't. It wasn't just a joke, it was a jab, and everyone in the room felt it. After the show, Paul approached Frank backstage. He kept it respectful, but direct. "You know I've never taken credit that wasn't mine," he said. Sinatra, drink in hand, brushed it off. "Relax, kid. You still got your royalties, didn't you?" That moment changed everything. It wasn't just about a song anymore. It was about ownership, about respect, about how easily someone like Sinatra could erase you with a sentence. From that night on, Paul saw the glitz for what it really was, a spotlight that could blind you if you stood in it too long. And he realized, in Frank's world, legends weren't shared. They were claimed. The deal he refused. After that cold backstage exchange, Paul Anka knew his days in Sinatra's shadow were numbered, but nothing prepared him for what came next. A few months later, Anka got a call, an offer actually. Sinatra's people wanted to repackage My Way for a major re-release tied to a new live album. But there was a catch. Frank wanted full publishing rights this time. That meant Sinatra would officially own the song. Paul was stunned. He had written the English lyrics. He had gifted it to Sinatra. And now, he was being asked to hand over the very song that had changed both their lives. In return, a hefty one-time payout and a handshake. For a moment, Paul considered it. The money was outrageous. But then he thought about what that deal really meant. If he signed, My Way would no longer be his way. So he refused. The fallout was swift. The phone calls stopped. Invitations disappeared. Rumors started circulating that Anka had gotten too big for his boots. And in Sinatra's world, that was a death sentence. Still, Paul didn't budge. He walked away from the offer, and possibly from one of the most powerful relationships in show business. Because to him, My Way wasn't just a hit. It was his legacy. And no price tag, no matter how steep, was worth rewriting that history. The shadows behind the glitz. To the public, the Sinatra-Anka connection always seemed like a glamorous friendship, two legends linked by a timeless song. But behind the tuxedos and standing ovations, Paul was living in a much more complicated reality. For years, he had tiptoed around Sinatra's ego, careful not to outshine the man whose approval still meant everything in Hollywood. But that approval came at a cost. Frank wasn't just a star, he was a kingmaker. And in his world, loyalty often meant silence. Anka had watched as others bent over backward to stay in Sinatra's good graces. He saw careers built and destroyed on nothing more than a nod or a cold shoulder. The darker rumors about Frank's mob ties, his temper, the way he handled people who crossed him, they weren't just stories. Paul had witnessed enough to know they were real. He kept quiet about it for decades. But as the years passed and the distance from that glittering era grew, Anka started pulling back the curtain just a little. In interviews, in memoirs, he hinted at what really went on. How power warped even the most talented men. How My Way became both a blessing and a burden. The truth was, Frank had needed the song. But Paul had needed to be seen, not just as the guy who wrote the words, but as someone who survived the system behind them. Because in the end, the glitz was never free. And every spotlight has a shadow, the burden of silence. For decades, Paul Anka carried the weight of a story he couldn't fully tell. While My Way played at funerals, presidential inaugurations, and even retirement parties, Anka stayed in the background, watching the world celebrate a song he had written but never truly claimed. He smiled in interviews. He praised Sinatra. He played the part. But behind the curtain, there was a different kind of tension, one rooted in quiet resentment and unspoken truth. He couldn't just come out and say what many suspected, that My Way had been hijacked by an industry obsessed with image and power. That behind the scenes, he often felt like a footnote in his own legacy. Speaking out meant alienating Sinatra's loyalists and tarnishing the myth surrounding one of music's most revered icons. So he stayed quiet. But that silence wasn't peace. Every time the song played, it stirred something deeper, a mix of pride, frustration, and a strange sadness. Because Paul didn't just write lyrics. He poured his soul into them. And now, they belong to a legend who barely acknowledged the man who gave them life. Even in his memoir, Paul treaded carefully. He told stories, but left room for interpretation. He exposed truths, but not all of them. There were things he still wouldn't say, because some secrets, he believed, could still burn bridges even after death. And maybe, deep down, part of him still wanted Frank to have the last word. Because no matter how complicated their relationship had been, Paul Anka had built something immortal. And letting the world question it felt safer than telling them the whole story. Finally reclaiming his truth. Now, in the twilight of his remarkable life, Paul Anka is no longer the quiet kid in Sinatra's shadow. He's a man who has lived through the highs and lows of fame, and who finally owns every part of his story. With the weight of decades lifted, Anka has begun to reclaim My Way, not as a tribute to Sinatra, but as a testament to his own journey. He's stepping onto stages with new confidence, telling audiences the real story behind the song, the struggles, the sacrifices, and the complicated emotions that shaped it. This isn't about rewriting history or seeking revenge. It's about honesty. It's about recognizing that legends are made not just by the voices we hear, but by the hands that craft their songs. Anka's words now carry the power of a man who endured control, fear, and silence, and emerged stronger. He no longer needs approval from the old guard or permission to speak. His legacy isn't just My Way. It's the story of resilience, of standing up quietly but firmly in a world built on showmanship and shadows. For too long, his voice was drowned out by the roar of the legend. Now it rings clear. Paul Anka didn't just write the soundtrack of a generation. He lived it and survived it on his own terms. And finally, the final note belongs to him. A legacy rewritten. Paul Anka's story isn't just about a famous song or a legendary friendship. It's about the cost of fame, the price of loyalty, and the quiet battles fought behind the spotlight. For decades, his truth was buried beneath the roar of Sinatra's legend, overshadowed but never erased. Now, with courage and clarity, Anka is rewriting that legacy. He's reminding the world that behind every icon, there's a story untold, a human being with struggles, compromises, and hard choices. The man who gave My Way its words isn't just a footnote in history. He's a survivor who found his own voice, finally singing it loud and clear. In the end, it's a powerful reminder. Greatness isn't just about the spotlight. Sometimes, it's about what happens in the shadows, and who has the strength to step out of them. Paul Anka's truth isn't just his own anymore. It's a story for anyone who's ever felt lost beneath someone else's fame, and a testament to the power of finally owning your way.